So it's exciting to be here. I've known Siobhan and James for a while, and I'm very happy to get to talk to everyone about kind of the neurophysiology of classical computation. Or more realistically, can a neuroscientist understand a microprocessor? And I think this is important as we start thinking about trying to build intelligent machines. Will we be able to understand them? And, you know, artificially intelligent machines may not actually exist yet, but we do have intelligent machines ostensibly as an example, right? Recent election results notwithstanding. And the question is, can we understand these sorts of systems, right? Now, a lot of what I do is, you could call it data science for scientific applications. I mean, we used to just call it science, but that's evidently not cool now. So the Obama administration in kind of 2012, and one of the things that kind of got me back into the scientific domain and made me think academia was exciting again, they announced this BRAIN initiative. They said, you know, based on this paper that was written by a couple of neuroscientists, they wanted to, you know, this is from the abstract, the Brain Activity Map project is aimed at reconstructing the full record of neural activity, right, across large numbers of neural circuits. So we have these computing systems that do this kind of intelligent work in our mind. We'd like to be able to look at all of that data and hopefully make progress on these kind of deep questions about neuroscience, right? But we don't have all of that data, and so we took a simpler model organism. If there's one thing that we've learned from DeepMind, it's that everyone loves old school video games. And so we took this old school microprocessor, the MOS 6502. It's got 3,500 transistors. It was designed by hand. Two dudes named Steve are here with an example. And we really understand how this processor works. Every undergraduate in computer science can tell you everything about it, from kind of the device physics level, how the silicon works, all the way up to notions of computational complexity, right, and how long things will take to run in asymptotic time. And we have this lovely block diagram here, right, on the right. And this really means that this is a system we can understand. And we're going to try and understand the system with various behavioral assays, the way a neuroscientist might, right? But our behavioral assays are Donkey Kong, Space Invaders, and Pitfall, games that were a little bit before my time, but that have attracted a lot of attention and, let's say, student interest over the years. And so people did connectomic reconstruction of this processor, right? Because the original schematic had been lost to time, they did the same thing that we do with brains in biology, including groups like the Allen Institute or the Howard Hughes group. They took the processor, right? They epoxied off the top. They looked at the dye under a microscope. They got a bunch of photos. They stitch it all together. And at the end of the day, using computer vision, they're capable of having a perfect simulation of the processor, right? Every voltage, every transistor state, right? And this is really what we in neuroscience would consider big data, right? This thing can actually generate about 500 megabytes a second of data. And from that data, then you think, well, can we apply the tools of neuroscience to understand what the computation is here that's happening? Because you get the entire time series here, right? Each of these dots is a transistor. And you're watching as it plays some part of the game, each transistor's activity averaged over time, increasing and decreasing. And this looks a lot like the kind of, you know, visualizations you might see if you go to YouTube and look at what people are recording from neuroscience projects these days. But this really makes us confront this question of what constitutes understanding, right? Is understanding just being able to predict what the system will do next? And if so, you know, at what scale? I might be able to tell you what a neuron will do in 2 milliseconds, but I probably can't tell you what it will do tomorrow. Right? So if we're just happy with a predictive level of understanding, where does that time cut off? And maybe we have incredibly complicated models. Maybe I can train a deep net to do what this processor will do in like 20 minutes or an hour. But if that model's so complicated, have I just kind of passed the buck there? Is understanding the ability to repair the system when it's broken? There was this guy, Yuri Laznik, who wrote the kind of inspiration for our paper called Could a Biologist Fix a Radio? And he argued that understanding a system meant when it was broken, you could identify the part that was broken and exploit this kind of hierarchy and modularity intrinsic in the system and repair it. Or maybe understanding is about notions of abstraction, right? David Marr had this wonderful idea back in the day. He was a computer vision scientist. And he said that, you know, you can imagine trying to understand intelligent systems at kind of a computation level where you ask, what is the task that they're trying to do? At an algorithm level of saying, kind of procedurally, how are they accomplishing that task? And at an implementation level of what is the substrate that's actually performing that task? And we kind of understand that at all levels for this processor, whereas a lot of these are still open questions in neuroscience. And there's an open question of what degree is this level of understanding necessary for the clinic, which I have strong opinions on and I'm happy to talk about later. But so we did some of these experiments on the processor, right? We did a lesion study. We discovered that since we have the whole processor, we can destroy individual transistors and see if games will still play. And just like a neuroscientist, we found that, 98 transistors, if you damage them, uniquely inhibit its ability to perform the Donkey Kong behavior. And as a neuroscientist, you would say, great, we found the Donkey Kong transistors. But of course, as electrical engineers and computer scientists, we know that's kind of nonsense. We can go up from the individual transistor level and exploit the fact that we can watch kind of every transistor over time, right? We have kind of the brain activity map for this chip. And we can do things like dimensionality reduction, where we take that 3,000 transistor time series and reduce it down to, let's say, 6 kind of fundamental dimensions of activity. And so we can look at which transistors are preferentially active on those lower dimensions, right? We're trying to seek out lower dimensional structure in this data. And we might see that, as we watch the processor playing these different games, we see that these lower dimensional representations are different. And we might say, hey, look, this lower dimensional representation here is preferentially active during Mario doing something. Clearly, we're understanding what the system is doing. But again, when you put on your computer science hat, you say, no, not quite, right? We're really just engaging in kind of quantitative phenomenology here. And of course, this has said nothing about kind of the underlying software or the algorithms or any of the other higher order things that we know are happening in this processor. And so maybe it's the conclusion that this is hopeless. It's the conclusion that neuroscience is just fundamentally screwed. And in fact, attempting to reverse engineer intelligent machines is a fool's errand. Should I just go back and do another startup? But I think there are actually some paths forward, right? We know that we need better algorithms, and this isn't surprising to those of us in this room who work on these sorts of things, but I think it is surprising to a lot of people in the neuroscience community, right? Because actually acquiring this data is so incredibly challenging. People spend their years, learning how to do small animal surgery and learning how to build microscopes, and end up assuming that based upon what they read in the New York Times, the machine learning side is solved and the computer will help them. But of course, that's not really the case. We still have tremendous strides to go. Russ was talking about the importance of kind of one-shot learning and supervised learning. And these are areas that we think might be able to, if we build better models, help us understand these systems. Closed-loop experiments. I fundamentally believe that kind of observational science for biology is a non-starter. Right? I think that projects like the Human Genome Project or the Brain Activity Map lay out great maps. But that sort of passive observation alone isn't going to help us, right? Ask astronomers about what they're kind of limited to in terms of passive observation. It's really, really hard. And in fact, what you want to be able to do is reduce your hypothesis space as quickly as possible via experiment. And fortunately, we have the ability to conduct these experiments. And organizations, this is a photo about a technique called, or a figure about a technique called photometry from Carl Dijkstra's lab at Stanford, where they're trying to make it very possible to quickly do these sorts of scientific interventions in neuroscience, combining optogenetics and imaging, such that they can, in an afternoon, instead of in a week or a month, or if you're a biology graduate student, the reality is a year or 2 years, run these sorts of experiments and hopefully prune down the hypothesis space more quickly. We're not just leaving ourselves to be kind of passive observers of this data. But I think there's also an incredibly important role here for kind of these sorts of synthetic systems, right? So eventually, due to the funding, one of my colleagues said, you should totally go into neuroscience. That's where all the funding is these days, neuroscience and AI. And it's true, there's tremendous interest kind of across organizations in acquiring this scale of data. And it will eventually be here. But it's not going to be here for a while, right? And so the hope is that maybe we can use some of these synthetic systems, right, these processors, to build algorithms and test our algorithms for understanding this data. And of course, the processor we use is this old school retro thing, right? Most people in my lab have never seen one, like a physical version of the chip, for example. So we have much more complicated processors today. This is an NVIDIA Tegra 2. And this is 1 billion transistors. And simply simulating a device like this on existing computers is incredibly time-consuming, right? If you ask your friends who do chip design, they'll tell you that simulation actually takes forever. And this ends up looking even more like an actual brain, right? This has kind of the functional localization that we know is present in a lot of biological systems. And so the hope is that by using systems like this, we can also kind of advance our algorithms long before we have to wait for the data to show up. So in conclusion, could a neuroscientist understand a computer? Well, I don't think this is game over, right? I think with kind of the combination of better algorithms, closing the loop, and better synthetic systems, we might actually be able to start making progress. But I want you to think every time you read an article in Wired or The Economist or the New York Times about neuroscientists do X, Y, or Z, and you see that this feels like real understanding, ask yourself, how does this compare to what we know about how computers actually work? And are we potentially a lot further away than we might like? And thanks to my collaborators, including Gary, who will speak later, for letting me be here. Good.